Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. My lighting is still terrible, and that's okay. Today we're talking about rage. We are talking about rage, and why are we talking about rage? Because I think rage is an interesting resource, and it has been problematic for a long time. So, rage is a unique resource in World of Warcraft, where by hitting your enemy, or by using some of your abilities, you generate a resource. This isn't technically unique to Warrior, as other classes generate either like arcane orbs or they generate maelstrom, so it's not like super unique, but as far as the melee classes are concerned, it's definitely one of the more fluid resources, because you're not necessarily playing around longer cooldown timings with your spells. You're mainly... what a great way to start my video, I had to burp. You're playing around your short cooldowns, but at a cost, right? Which is why I think Rage is interesting. Energy doesn't really have the same feel to it, because you always have energy, but just how much you regenerate is based on either your class resource or how many bleeds you have up, stuff like that. Things like I've played a little bit of... Monk is probably one of my least played classes in this entire game, so I can't really speak to how its energy resource is, but you also have Chi to consider. So you have multiple resources on top of it, or Warrior just has Rage. And Rage is always, or historically, been problematic at an expansion launch. That's why you've seen probably a lot of talk about it through this beta cycle. But initially... going back to, let's do a little history, right? Going back to Dragonflight, Rage, Arms wasn't very good at the start of Dragonflight, but after the 0.5 patch, where it got a little bit better pathing in its class tree, one of the problems that the class actually had was it just had infinite Rage, and the reason why having infinite of your class resource is kind of bad is simply because it becomes boring, right? Being able to manage your class resource, how you're spending things, is an interesting part of how the game itself is played. And that's why, especially in execute phase, you'll see a large difference between how much damage someone does compared to somebody else by how they actually micromanage their rage, so they don't have too much to where they're overcapping, and they don't have too little, so they're always able to cast their primary spells on cooldown, like Mortal Strike. So there is definitely skill expression in that. But in the early days of Dragonflight, we basically had infinite Rage, and it was kind of a problem because it was, like I said, boring. So going... I don't know if it was Season 2 specifically, but going into those next changes, they rebalanced the entire Rage system, right? They took away things like Colossus Smash giving you Recklessness as arms. They reduced the cost of Cleave, Thunderclap, Rend, and Slam all to 20 Rage, right? Mortal Strike remained at 30, and Execute remained dynamic at 20 to 40, so even when you're playing inside your Execute windows, you get to micromanage your rage between tactician procs and overpower uses and all that good stuff, right? I feel there was something I was missing about that. What was it exactly? I feel like I'm missing a direct point. Oh yes, Test of Might. The reason why this infinite rage cost was actually somewhat, or one of the reasons why it was so contentious, is because an ability that was, or a talent that was removed for Warrior, or from Arms specifically, was called Test of Might, which is while your Colossus Smash was active on a target, every amount of rage you spent, or after, I think it's like, depending on what you're talented into, so Colossus Smash lasts 10 seconds, so after 10 seconds, the amount of rage you spent in that 10-second window gave you a stacking strength buff based on how much rage you spent. So what we were doing is we had things like Sword of Storms, which is now a talent... Where is it? They just get rid of it? Yeah, they just got rid of Sword of Storms because nobody used it. But Sword of Storms was a talent that increased your Thunderclap cost and your whirlwind cost. And you had another talent that increased your whirlwind cost and gave whirlwind a cooldown, as an example. So what you ended up doing in some of these situations, because you had infinite rage, is you go into a Colossus Smash window and you would macro things like whirlwind, which cost 60 rage, and ignore pain, which which originally had a fluctuating cost, could cost up to 40 rage. So you would go into a Colossus Smash window with infinite rage and instantly spend 100 of it using Whirlwind and Ignore Pain as a damage bonus. Because if you played the window correctly, you could use that Whirlwind Ignore Pain combo at the very start, and you could use Whirlwind and Ignore Pain at the very end of that. I think it was like around a 13 to 15 second window, because Ignore Pain had a 12-second cooldown on it, I believe, at the time. So if you did that, you could use both of those spells and drop as much rage as possible in that window. And that gameplay kind of sucked, right? Nobody liked spending, like, you gained defensive value for using something in an offensive manner, which was cool, but nobody liked pressing Ignore Pain as a damage button. It just wasn't thematic. It didn't fit well. It was just kind of stupid, right? So that's one of the reasons why that rage change was made and why it matters, because that play style sucked. So we went into having 20 rage cost on all our stuff, 30 rage, 40 rage, whatever. But now it's always a problem at the start of an expansion cycle of how much rage we actually generate. Because previously we actually had a lot of different ways to generate rage. But now, if we look at the entirety of our class, of our tree, right? This entire tree, we have had so many abilities that would generate rage, generally pruned back, nerfed, or removed completely. Avatar no longer generates rage on its own. Ravager no longer generates rage on hit. Bladestorm no longer generates rage on hit. I think it used to generate 10 rage on hit. There's a talent for Overpower that I think this talent replaced, where Overpower generated 8 rage every time it was used on a target under 35% health. Excuse me. So in all of our class tree, we have all of these talents, and the only thing is we have a reduced rage cost for Slam, and then we do have some increased amount of rage here. Auto attacks generate 10% more rage here, and then you have this talent which increases your auto attack speed. And for arms specifically, auto attacks are insanely important because it is the only way you're realistically generating rage in 99% of situations. We do have Blood Surge. And Blood Surge has a chance, damage from Rend has a chance to generate 5 rage. That is the only other source of rage generation that arms currently has. So almost all of our rage is currently from auto attacks. And whenever you go into a new expansion, like you've already seen our rage generation nerfed by 20% and then brought back up from 20% because our auto attacks are everything. It's all of our rage. It's all of our rage source. And that's why talent like this is a guaranteed lock-in, not only because it leads to Battlefield Commander, but it increases your auto attack speed by 20% by 10 seconds whenever your auto attack crits. And that leads into the stat squish part of why rage is always so problematic on an expansion launch, because for arms, the amount of haste you have is the amount of auto attacks you have. Because our crit gets squished, obviously I'm wearing a bunch of like random gear, so my gear is not specifically tuned to have haste crit for arms, because I play arms and fury with this random gear set, so obviously it's not going to be as much crit as we should have at the start of an expansion for the class. But we're looking at upwards of 40 to 50% haste, 40 to 50% crit. Then we go into a new expansion, and because crit influences how much rage we generate through talents like Wild Strikes, and critical strikes from auto attacks in general generate more rage, we lose a significant portion of our rage generation going into a new expansion, and that's why it's always funky. That's why it's always hard to balance right, because if you have too much rage, then none of it matters, which is what people didn't like about Dragonflight Season 1, so all it was about was spending rage, because you just had too much of it, and micromanaging it didn't matter. Or if you have too little rage, then you're not really able to press buttons when you want to press them, even if they're coming off cooldown, even if you're playing kind of properly, because let's say you're playing a class like Colossus, and Colossus is played primarily around talents like Battle Lord, which reset the cooldown of Mortal Strike. Battle Lord used to give you 10 rage every single time you reset. Mortal Strike. Now it gives you 0. So that's just an additional 10 rage you lose every time you cast an additional 30 cost Mortal Strike, which is more than what you're normally spending on a general ability. So rage is always in this weird, contentious issue between the start of an expansion, where we lose all of these stats and we lose all of how everything is supposed to be played, as well as the issue developers have of the too little too much. It is an interesting resource, for sure. And one of I guess the only real tool we have now, which I'm not even talented into, is Rend generating rage. Personally, the problem I actually have with Rend is it has nothing to do with its damage. Rend might be a required button to play because it generates rage if we don't have enough rage, right? It might be just required because Blood Craze is so early in our class tree, it's almost like something they want you to take, right? They want you to take this, they want you to play it, they want you to play Rend on arms. Fury does not have a talent that generates rage through Rend tick, so Fury's kind of like Slayer Fury. I don't really see a reason to play it, even though Rend is free for Fury. Thane, you're playing Rend just because Rend is spread through T-Clap and your T-Blast, so it's just free damage, basically. But the main issue I have with the button as a whole is it is basically a 20-second maintenance buff on a class that you're supposed to be doing big hits and big dam with. And what I would like to see, personally, is bloodletting changed. Currently, or what they did to bloodletting before, is it did not have this, if you have Rend, Mortal Strike generates Rend on targets below 35% health. People were complaining that pressing Rend because of its rage generation effect was really counterintuitive, did not feel good in execute phases, so they added this. I don't think that's necessarily the full case, but what I would like bloodletting to do instead is when you hit a target or targets with either Mortal Strike or Cleave, your core rotational abilities in AoE or single target, it will extend the duration of Rend on those targets. Not that it extends it indefinitely, but if you're, let's say, in Mythic Plus, and you're fighting a pack of mobs for, I don't know, 45 seconds, right? 45, 50 seconds, you're fighting and killing off this full pack of mobs, right? I feel you should only have to press Rend once. If you want to press it to apply it, and then through proper play and proper positioning, it allows you to extend that buff all the way until the pack is essentially dead. I think that would be a much better play style and use case for it, because as it stands, if we do need to take Rend on a class like on a hero talent like Slayer, where it doesn't feel good to take, it does very little damage, and we're mainly taking it because it generates rage. Excuse me. I really think that if you play correctly, if you're hitting your Mortal Strike on cooldown, that kind of thing, Rend should automatically refresh and, well, not refresh, it should extend itself, so you're only having to hit Rend maybe once every 45 seconds if you're just playing it normally, right? And that's why I think it's difficult that's why I think balancing a rage as a resource is so difficult, because there's such a finite balance between too little, too much. What do you need? What do you don't? Can you get away with not taking additional rage regeneration as Slayer because you're casting a lot more free sudden deaths because of your hero talent? So those empty globals are potentially filled with executes instead that are free of cost and now trigger Tactician, which is another free button. Is that enough? It just feels very weird. Warriors always had a very odd relationship with its primary class resource because of how finicky it can be. So I do hope that there's still time, and going forward, they do change things like this, where realistically, casting a maintenance buff every 20 seconds sucks, right? It depends on your class, right? So for Enhancement Shaman, you cast. There's a button that's on a cooldown. Um, it's got a short cooldown, but I think it's like was it like Thunder Crash or something. I don't remember exactly what it is, but for about 10 seconds, it enables all of your single target stuff to do AoE, right? Which that as a maintenance buff and a rotational ability, I think is fine. But when it comes to something like Rend for Warrior, that's a bleed, a 20-second maintenance buff just kind of sucks, even if it's required. People will use it, people will play it, but I just think that they can remove some of the maintenance feeling of Rend and make it more enjoyable to use if they change things like bloodletting to allow it to auto extend itself through proper play, so you're not hitting the fucking thing all the time. Because if you're hitting it all the time and it's not doing a lot of damage, it just feels bad because all it's doing is generating rage. Because rage as a resource is only built by auto attacks. And then we go into the issue of, well, what is actually, before I say that, before I reiterate something, this is technically where haste is supposed to be the primary factor, right? Haste is how much your auto attacks are, and haste primarily, which is something what people call ability haste, is this green icon on your tooltip. So your mortal strikes, your cleaves, some of your other abilities, mainly your primary rotational ones for warrior, are have a variable amount of cooldown on them based on the amount of haste you have. The reason that is because through your general gameplay, you should be able to cast your... You should be always able to cast your button. So like Mortal Strike is every 4 globals, right? So if we go up to this dummy, and I hit Mortal Strike, 1, 2, 3, Mortal Strike is off cooldown on the 4th global. And with that variable haste cooldown, or I guess I should just call it ability haste, because that's what it is. With that variability, it means that no matter how much haste you have, no matter how it's going up and down, you will still have that same gameplay and rotational feel where Mortal Strike is every 4 globals, unless you're playing a talent specifically like Battlelord, which changes it. It's the same thing with Cleave. Cleave is every 3 globals. So we'll go up, we'll hit our Cleave. 1, 2, Cleave is available. Cleave. So it allows you to have the same rotation, even though your global cooldown and your ability cooldowns have this dynamic flow to them because of the amount of haste you have. And that's supposed to solve that kind of issue where you are excuse me, that's supposed to solve that issue to where your resource generation is equivalent to how much percentage resource you're spending based on your variable cooldowns with that ability haste. But because of the additional sources that we have, either through auto attacks or how much our secondary stats actually influence the amount of rage generation we have, especially as arms, it feels very, very awkward, and it's why it's always kind of been a problematic resource, especially at the start of the expansions. And it's one of the main things people source is that even though through proper play and proper rotation and then proper maintenance, which people don't want to use this button, right? But if this button was less annoying to use, people might be fine using it. The class doesn't feel good to play, even though technically nothing's really changed that much about it. I don't know. There's probably not much else for me to go into specifically about Rage, but it's just an interesting thing that I feel it's just interesting to talk about, because when you consider it, you have to consider the design of the game and how that ability haste and how haste as a resource actually affects but doesn't technically affect how your class plays, because you're supposed to spend just as much as you gain as you get more secondary stats. But because of RNG sources like crit or blood surge, there's a lot of other we don't have any other sources in our tree. We've lost those sources. Hopefully, with the removal of all of these additional sources and a primary focus on rotational playing rotationally well, they might move Warrior into a situation where Rage is not nearly as big of an issue and it feels good to play and it feels good to use. Fury, however, is its own bag of worms where now you have your spenders are rotationally more expensive or less expensive depending on if you're in cooldowns, and it kind of changes it that way. Fury is its own can of worms currently, which we'll see if they make any changes to in this next update, and I'll probably get into. But I don't know. I just like yapping about Warrior stuff. I think Rage is really cool. I think it's interesting and it's very unique since we do not have any additional resource sources for our class. That it is a very unique playstyle to Warrior and something that I think the devs do put a lot of focus on. And hopefully we'll get right and we'll get well and it will feel good to play. And we're going forward doing cool stuff. As far as upcoming things, I like stealing content ideas from other people, so I'm going to do a tier list video on the World Within, ranking the World Within raid bosses. That'll be fun. And then I will probably do another video on Fury, just because Fury has its own set of problems, its own can of worms, which I'll get into with that video, but that's kind of what you got to look forward to. I'm just here yapping a bit because yapping is fun. I do know I repeat myself a decent amount of time, but it is what it is. I'm trying to get better through a few ways, like making myself a short list of topics before I start a video on like my side monitor, as an example. But we'll see. We'll see how things goes, and I'll see you in the next video. Okay. Bye-bye.